Wyatt asked me to take a week off work for a farm I didn't even know still existed in his life, and when I asked why, all he said was, "Trust me, there's a surprise you're not ready for," which is a genuinely alarming thing to hear from a grown man who once cried during a dog food commercial. I need to explain who Wyatt was to me before any of this makes sense, because roommate undersells it in a way that's almost funny now. We'd been living together for a little over a year, in a two-bedroom apartment that was too expensive for either of us alone, found through a mutual friend who'd moved out of state and left us to split the lease. I worked in graphic design. He worked as a large animal vet tech at a clinic across town, a job that meant he sometimes came home smelling like a barn even though we lived nowhere near one, which I used to tease him about relentlessly. What I didn't know for most of that year was that he actually came from a barn, an actual one. A working dairy and orchard farm 3 hours north, run by his family for 3 generations, a whole life he almost never talked about, and when he did, he changed the subject fast enough that I eventually stopped asking, the way you learn not to poke at a bruise once you've noticed the flinch a couple times. I knew there'd been tension with his father. I knew he called his grandmother more than anyone else in his family, soft-voiced calls he took on the fire escape even in winter. I knew he hadn't been home in almost 3 years. That was the whole picture I had, and I'd made peace with not knowing more because Wyatt volunteered information the way some people ration water in a drought, carefully, and only when it felt survivable. Between us, meanwhile, something had been building for months that neither of us had named. Late-night conversations that ran longer than they needed to. A specific kind of quiet in the apartment on nights it was just the two of us, some current running under normal roommate behavior that both of us seemed to be choosing not to acknowledge. There'd been one night, back in the fall, half a bottle of wine in, where we'd ended up sitting closer on the couch than the movie really required, and something had almost happened. I still don't fully know what either of us would have called it if it had before his phone rang and broke whatever was building, and neither of us ever brought it up again. So when he came home one Tuesday in April looking like he'd made some decision he was scared of and told me his grandmother had asked him to come home and that he wanted me there with him, my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was confusion, layered with something more complicated underneath. "Why me?" I asked. "Wouldn't you rather bring, I don't know, a friend from the clinic, someone who actually knows anything about farms?" "I don't want someone who knows about farms," he said. "I want you there, that's the whole reason." "That's not really an answer." "I know," he said. "I'm working up to a better one, just will you come a week?" "I already talked to your boss actually, which I probably shouldn't have done without asking you first, but she said it's fine, you have the PTO." "You talked to my boss?" I panicked and did something a little insane. "Yes, please come to the farm, Nate." I said yes, obviously I said yes. You don't say no to someone looking at you like the entire shape of his future hinges on a single answer, even if you don't yet understand why. The drive up took just over 3 hours and Wyatt got quieter with every mile, the closer we got, until by the last 20 minutes he'd stopped talking almost entirely, just staring out at fields going by like they held something he was bracing himself for. "You okay?" I asked. "I haven't been back since I came out to my dad," he said, which was the most direct he'd ever been about any of it. "3 years ago, it didn't go well. I've seen my mom and my grandmother a handful of times since, always somewhere else, a diner off the highway, a hotel 2 towns over. Never here, never at the actual farm. And now you're going back." "My grandmother asked me to. She said there's something she needs to tell me in person, and my dad's agreed to let it happen at the house, which apparently is a bigger deal than it sounds like, given the history. And you brought me into the middle of that." "I brought you," he said, "because I didn't think I could walk back into that house without you there, and because," he stopped, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. "I'll explain the rest once we're there, I promise, I just need to get through the door first." The farmhouse, when we finally pulled up the long gravel drive, was exactly the kind of place you picture when someone says the word farmhouse: white paint peeling in patches, a wraparound porch, an orchard visible behind it in neat, aging rows. It looked like something out of a memory that wasn't mine, and I felt strangely like an intruder just standing in the driveway. Wyatt's grandmother came out to meet us before we'd even made it to the porch steps. A small, sharp-eyed woman who moved slower than I suspect she used to, but with no less certainty in her stride. "There he is," she said, pulling Wyatt into a hug that he sank into like it had been years since he'd let himself be held that way, which, I realized, it probably had been. Then she turned her attention to me and her eyes did something quick and assessing, the way grandmothers do. "You must be Nate," she said. "Wyatt talks about you more than he thinks he does." "Gran," Wyatt said, a warning and an embarrassment in the same breath. "I'm just telling the truth," she said, entirely unbothered. "Come in, both of you. Your father's out in the east field, Wyatt. He'll be in for supper." The house itself was warm in a way that surprised me, given everything Wyatt had implied about it: worn furniture, family photos going back generations, the smell of something baking that made the whole place feel lived in rather than tense. It didn't match the version of this house I'd built in my head from 3 years of careful silence. Supper that night was its own kind of ordeal. Wyatt's father, a broad, weathered man named Russell who looked like an older, harder version of Wyatt around the eyes, greeted his son with a handshake instead of a hug, which told me most of what I needed to know about where things currently stood between them. "Nate," Russell said, shaking my hand too, his grip firm and his expression unreadable. "Wyatt's roommate." "That's right," I said, and something in the specific weight he put on the word roommate made it clear he knew, or suspected, there was more to it, and had decided the safest place to leave the conversation was right there, undefined. Dinner conversation stayed carefully on the surface: the state of the orchard, a broken piece of machinery, a neighbor's dispute over a fence line. Wyatt participated in short, careful sentences, the way you talk when you're monitoring every word for how it might land. I watched him fold into a smaller, more guarded version of himself at that table than I'd ever seen in our apartment, and it made something in my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. After dinner, his grandmother asked to speak with him alone, and I sat out on the porch with a cup of coffee I didn't really want, listening to the specific quiet of a place with no city noise, feeling like I'd stepped into the middle of a story I only had half of. Wyatt came out almost 40 minutes later, and something in his face had shifted, not resolved exactly, but like a door had been opened that had been locked for a long time. "She's sick," he said, sitting down heavily beside me on the porch steps. Not urgently sick, the doctors say she's got time, but sick in the kind of way that makes a person start settling their affairs, and one of the things she wants settled is this farm." "What does that mean?" "My dad wants to sell it, once she's gone or maybe sooner. He's tired, Nate. He's run this place alone since my grandfather died 4 years ago, and he doesn't think either of my sisters or I wanted enough to take it on, and he's probably right about my sisters. But my grandmother, she doesn't want it sold. She wants it to stay in the family, and she asked me tonight if there was any version of my life where I'd consider coming back and running it." "What did you tell her?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the dark shape of the orchard. "I told her there's a version of my life where that's possible," he said, "but only if it includes you." And she looked at me like she already knew that before I said it, which, honestly, is probably true because I don't think I've ever managed to talk about you to her without it being obvious. My chest did something complicated hearing that. "Wyatt, what are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying," he said, and his voice wasn't steady anymore, "that the surprise I mentioned in the car, the whole reason I wanted you here instead of just doing this alone, is that there's an old hay barn out past the orchard that hasn't been used for storage in years, and about 6 months ago, without telling you, I started fixing it up. Small renovations. Whenever I came up here on weekends, you thought I was visiting a friend from vet school. New windows, insulation, a loft space. I've been turning it into a place someone could actually live in." "For who?" "For us," he said finally, like the word had been sitting behind his teeth for months, waiting for the nerve to come out. I didn't know how to say this without it sounding insane, so I kept putting it off, and then Gran got sick, and everything got urgent all at once, and I didn't want to keep pretending anymore that the reason I've been fixing up that barn is just about having a project. I've been building a place for you and me, Nate, before I even had the courage to ask if that was something you'd ever want." I sat there on that porch step for a long moment, the night sounds of a place I'd never been before pressing in around us, trying to catch up to everything he just handed me at once. "You've been in love with me," I said slowly, "for long enough to build a house." "I've been in love with you," he said, "for about as long as I've been afraid to say it, which is longer than I want to admit. That night on the couch last fall, I almost said something then. I've regretted not saying it every day since. I told myself I'd wait for the right moment, and then Gran called, and I realized I might not have as much time as I thought to keep waiting for the perfect one." "This is a lot," I said honestly, because it was a farm, your family, a whole life I didn't know was on the table 20 minutes ago. "I know I'm not asking you to decide tonight. I'm not even sure I've fully decided myself whether I can actually do this, take over the farm, come back to a place where my dad still can't quite look at me the same way since I told him who I am. I just needed you to know the whole truth of it before I asked you anything else, because you deserve to make whatever choice comes next with all the information, not a version I kept editing down to protect myself. We didn't resolve anything that night. I want to be honest about that because this isn't the kind of story where the porch confession fixes everything in one conversation. We went to bed in separate rooms, his childhood room and the guest room down the hall, both of us lying awake, I'm sure, turning over everything that had just cracked open between us. The next morning, Wyatt took me out to see the barn before anyone else was awake. It was better than I expected, honestly not finished, exposed beams and half-painted walls, but there was a clear shape to it, a loft with two windows that caught the morning light in a way that made the whole space feel less like a barn and more like the beginning of an actual home. "You did all this yourself?" I asked, running my hand along a windowsill he'd clearly sanded by hand. "Mostly, my grandmother helped some before she got sick. She's the only one who knew what I was really building this for until last night." "It's beautiful, Wyatt." "It's not finished," he said. "I don't even know if it ever will be if you tell me this isn't something you want. I built it hopping, not knowing. I want to be honest about that part too. I didn't have your permission to hope this hard, and I know that's a strange thing to confess." I stood there in that half-finished loft, morning light falling across floorboards he'd laid by hand for a future he wasn't sure would ever include the person he'd built it for. And I felt the whole weight of what he'd been carrying alone for months settle into something I finally understood. "I need to talk to your dad," I said, which surprised even me coming out of my mouth. "Before I can answer anything about the farm, I need to understand what it would actually mean, coming back here for both of you. I don't want to be the reason you build a life that's still full of the same silence you've been running from for 3 years." Wyatt looked startled by that, then something like relief passed over his face, like he'd been hoping someone would say exactly that, even if he hadn't known how to ask for it himself. I found Russell alone later that morning, repairing a fence at the edge of the east field, and I walked over before I could talk myself out of it. "Can I ask you something?" I said, "and I'd appreciate an honest answer even if it's not a comfortable one." He straightened up wary. "All right. Wyatt's been building a home out in that old barn, for the two of us, if I understand it right. I need to know if he comes back here, if he takes over this farm, is there room in your version of this family for who he actually is? Because I won't let him give up his life in the city to come back to a smaller version of the same silence he grew up hiding in." Russell was quiet for a long moment, working his jaw the way I'd seen Wyatt do when he was choosing words carefully. "I said some things 3 years ago I've had time to regret," he said finally. "I was scared and grief-stricken over my own father passing that same year, and I took some of that out on Wyatt in a way I shouldn't have. I've had 3 years to sit with that. I'm not going to pretend I've got it all figured out. This isn't a part of the world that makes any of this easy, and I know that better than most. But my mother's dying slowly, and she spent her whole life loving that boy exactly as he is, no conditions, and if I don't figure out how to do the same before she's gone, I don't think I'll forgive myself." "That's not quite a yes," I said. "No," he agreed, "it's not, but it's more honest than anything I managed to say to him 3 years ago, and I think that's worth something if he's willing to let it be a start instead of demanding it be a finish." I told Wyatt what his father said later that day, sitting out by the barn again, and I watched something in him crack open, not into relief exactly, but into something more complicated and more hopeful than the guarded version of himself I'd seen at dinner the night before. "That's not nothing," he said quietly. "Coming from him, that's genuinely not nothing." "It's a start," I agreed. "Whether it becomes enough is going to take time, probably longer than one visit. I don't think either of us should pretend that's not true." We stayed at the farm for the rest of the week, and something shifted slowly day by day. Wyatt's grandmother pulled me aside one afternoon, while Wyatt was out helping his father with the milking, and told me things about Wyatt's childhood I don't think he'd ever fully told me himself. How he'd been the one who noticed the calves when they were sick before anyone else did. How he used to sit up with the animals through difficult births even as a boy. How leaving for the city had cost him a version of himself he'd been trying to rebuild ever since in careful, quiet ways I'd apparently been living alongside for a year without fully understanding. "He's been happier this week than I've seen him in 3 years," she told me, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. "I don't know what happens with this farm or with my son or with any of it long term, But I know that boy loves you in a specific way that doesn't come around twice in most people's lives, and I'd hate to see either of you talk yourselves out of it because the timing's complicated. By the end of the week, Russell and Wyatt had a conversation I wasn't present for out in the barn that lasted almost 2 hours. I don't know everything that was said. What I know is that Wyatt came back to the house afterward with his eyes red in a way that told me it had been hard and important and not fully resolved, but real in a way 3 years of silence hadn't been. He's not going to be perfect about it, Wyatt told me that night back in the loft sitting on the floor because there wasn't furniture yet. He said some things that still hurt, but he also said he wants to actually try, not just tolerate me from a distance the way he has been. He said if I want to come back and run this place, he'd rather have me here imperfectly figuring it out together, than lose the farm to strangers and lose me to the city permanently at the same time. How do you feel about that? Scared, he admitted, hopeful, both somehow at the same time, which I didn't think was possible until this week. And the barns. He looked at me, and for the first time since the porch confession, there was something steady in his expression instead of just hopeful. The barn's still here, it's still not finished, but I'm not asking you to decide our whole future tonight, Nate. I just needed you to see it, to understand what I've been quietly hopping for, so that whatever we decide next, we decide it with everything actually out in the open. I didn't give him an answer that night or even that week. What I gave him instead was something more honest, an agreement to try, not a full leap into farm life immediately, not some fairy tale ending where I quit my job and moved north the following month. We went back to the city together, back to our apartment, and over the following months we built toward it slowly, me taking on freelance design work that could travel with me, Wyatt commuting up some weekends to keep working on the barn and rebuilding, carefully, imperfectly, something with his father that neither of us pretended was fully healed. It took almost a year before we actually moved into that loft full-time. By then his grandmother had gotten sicker, and there was a specific aching urgency to wanting her to see us settled there while she still could, which she did, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse one afternoon in early autumn, watching Wyatt carry the last of our boxes into the barn he'd built with his own hands for a future he hadn't been sure would ever come. Russell still isn't the version of a father who talks easily about any of it. He's better than he was, though, better at showing up, better at asking real questions instead of avoiding the subject entirely, better at treating me like part of the family instead of an arrangement he's tolerating. It's not the ending I would have written if you'd asked me 3 years ago what reconciliation was supposed to look like. It's slower than that and rougher around the edges, and somehow more believable because of it. I think about that drive up the quiet miles, Wyatt bracing himself for a door he hadn't walked through in 3 years, and I think about how close I came to only seeing the surface of what he was carrying. A farm, a family, a complicated history I assumed I understood from the outside. What I actually found, once I got there, was a man who had spent months quietly building a place for a future he was terrified to ask for out loud. In a barn full of morning light he'd sanded and painted alone, hoping someone would eventually walk into it and understand exactly what it meant. He begged me to come to that farm not because he had a surprise waiting to impress me, but because he didn't think he could survive walking back into his own history without someone beside him who already knew the truest version of who he was. I didn't expect a barn. I didn't expect a father trying, slowly and imperfectly, to become someone new. I didn't expect to fall in love with a version of a life I never knew I wanted, standing in a half-finished loft with morning light on the floorboards, watching a man who'd spent a year quietly hopping. I'd choose this too. I keep choosing it actually a little more each season. The way you choose most things worth having, not all at once but slowly on purpose, again and again.